Well, thanks everyone for coming to my talk, The Use of Clustering in Human Solutions of the Traveling Salesperson Problem by myself, Vijay Marupudi, and my collaborators, Veena Harsh, Vimal Rao, Jimin Park, Jeff Bai, and Professor Shashank Verma. So to begin with, what is the Traveling Salesperson Problem? So it's a problem that involves finding the shortest path connecting a set of points while starting and ending at the same point. So if you have a set of points like the ones here, the optimal TSP solution, or the shortest path, would be the one here. So the TSP belongs to a problem class called NP-hard, which generally means that the time complexity of this problem is greater than or equal to exponential time. This means that with a small increase in the number of points, you see an exponential increase in the time to find an optimal solution. So why study the traveling salesperson problem? The problem can provide us insight into problem-solving strategies and heuristics used for intractable problems where finding an exact solution is pretty hard. And it also has wide applicability. The TSP shows up in navigation, planning, and optimization problems all the time, and people do perform these or complete these problems. So it can be useful to study the TSP. And why study human solutions of the traveling salesperson problem? Well, humans are pretty good at this task. If you look at the graph here, it shows that people produce solutions for the traveling salesperson problem in linear time with the number of points. So people are pretty fast, which is not bad for a problem that has exponential time complexity. And people don't seem to sacrifice solution quality to do so. If you look at the graph here, it shows that people's solutions are generally within 10% of the optimal TSP solution. And so it's interesting to know why they're so good at this task. The strategies used for the traveling salesperson problem might also be used for other intractable problems, which makes it a productive problem to study it. So how do people solve the traveling salesperson problem? Well, prior research has suggested the following hypotheses: the crossing avoidance hypotheses, sequential convex hull hypotheses, and clustering hypotheses. I'll just go into these. So the crossing avoidance hypothesis suggests that people aim to avoid crossings or intersections in their TSP because they understand that crossings are not optimal. So if you look at the image here, the solid black line is a TSP with a crossing. But by theoretically, you can always swap out a crossed TSP with a non-crossed TSP, as shown by the dotted lines, to make it more optimal. You can always do that. However, this hypothesis does not necessarily predict the optimality of human solutions, because suboptimal solutions of the TSP can also contain no Tor crossings. So we would like more explanation as to why people are so optimal. The next hypothesis is the convex hull hypothesis. So what a convex hull is, it's the set of points that encloses all other points in a stimulus or a set of points. And so the convex hull hypothesis suggests that people connect the points on the convex hull in order and then pick up other points along the way when they're close. So one limitation of this hypothesis is that the time complexity is greater than linear. It's O(n) log n, which does not necessarily match with humans. And just the general limitations of the previous hypotheses is that they might be representing properties of optimal TSP solutions, because all optimal solutions do not have crossings and connect the convex hull points in order. And they might not be providing an account of human strategies. So we thought that clustering is a promising strategy for people to be using to solve the traveling salesperson problem, because it really reduces the search space. It decomposes the problem into smaller subproblems, which participants can then solve and then connect all the smaller subproblems together. It makes it way more tractable. For example, you have a 100-point TSP. If you look at all the possible tours, it's 100 factorial. I mean, that's a pretty high number. But if you break it into 10 clusters, you only get around 40 million possible solutions, dramatically reducing the search space. People don't necessarily search through 40 million solutions, but it does reduce the size of the problem. And prior research has suggested that people might be using the clustering hypothesis or the clustering strategy. So Kong and Shin in 2007 presented a clustering model that used k-means to generate clusters and then generated solutions that were correlated with human solutions. However, ongoing work in our lab suggests that k-means is not a good model of how people cluster. And also people have pretty decent variation in their clusterings. Different participants might cluster very differently. So we do not know whether the clusters people draw are used to solve the traveling salesperson problem. In our lab, we started investigating this. So in prior work, we wanted to see if clustering is a stable enough ability. So if clustering is similar every time you do it, it can be a good basis for a strategy. And we find that it is. So by reliability or stability, we mean the similarity of two clusterings on the same set of points by the same person at two different time points. So importantly, we see that clustering is more reliable on statistically clustered stimuli. So if you look at the blue bars here, compared to the dispersed stimuli. And what do we mean by statistically clustered or dispersed? So here's like an example of both. As you can see, the points here are more clumped together, while the points here are more evenly spaced out. And in previous work, we also found that TSP solutions follow the same pattern of reliability as human clustering. So by TSP reliability, we mean the similarity of two TSP solutions, which is the percentage of edges that are overlapping between two TSPs of the same stimulus by the same person at two different time points. And we see that TSP solutions are also more reliable for statistically clustered stimuli compared to dispersed stimuli. You can see the graph here, it stays generally high for clustered stimuli with increasing number of points, but dispersed stimuli, it goes down pretty fast. So our research question now is to get a confirmation, like whether people's clusters that they draw themselves correspond to the TSP solution. So more direct evidence for this hypothesis. So on to the methods. So 67 undergraduate students participated in our study, and it was a 5x2 within subjects design. So there were 5 different numbers of points ranging from 10 to 30, and there were 2 different cluster structures, clustered or dispersed. And we used 40 stimuli. So participants first clustered the 40 stimuli, and then they completed a distractor task. And then they solved the traveling salesperson problem on the same stimuli. Half the stimuli were flipped on the second time so that participants wouldn't notice. And we didn't find any evidence of them noticing. So we did not include this flipping factor in our analyses. And just a reminder of what the clustered or dispersed stimuli are. So examples there. And here's a video of the interfaces they used. So for clustering, they use their mouse to draw clusters around points, and the color indicates cluster membership. And for the traveling salesperson problem, they click the points to add them to the tour. They cannot undo, and clicking the final point completes the tour. So on to the results. So we needed to calculate a deviance metric of a clustering compared to a TSP. So this is the metric we came up with. So here T means the number of cross-cluster transitions in a TSP. This will become more concrete later, but it means that if you have an edge on a TSP and the points, both the points, if they belong to different clusters, that's a cross-cluster transition. C is the number of clusters, and N is the total number of points in the stimulus. So when this metric is 0, it means that it is perfectly congruent with the clustering. The TSP solution is perfectly congruent with the clustering. And when it's 1, it means that it's maximally deviant. So we took the TSP solutions of participants and we overlaid their own clustering of the same stimulus on top of it. And then we put the metric in the middle of the diagram. And on the left, you see these are perfectly congruent pairs, which means that the TSP solution only enters and exits each cluster once. This is very good evidence that participants are clustering. And then for certain items, we see deviant pairs, which means that the participants enter or exit each cluster more than twice. So what do we generally find? We find that more than half, or 52% of TSP solutions were perfectly congruent with the participants clustering of the same stimulus. So we see this as very strong evidence that participants might be clustering to solve the traveling salesperson problem. And if you look at the orange bars here, for clustered stimuli, they contain more perfectly congruent pairs compared to dispersed stimuli. It's important to note that this is not just like a low heuristic because the distribution is still shifted towards 0, but these are just the perfectly congruent pairs. So if you look at the trend over number of points, for clustered stimuli, you see that the perfect congruence stays pretty high and always stays above the congruence for dispersed stimuli. It suggests that cluster structure plays a role. And this gives us structural evidence that participants might be clustering to solve the TSP, but we wanted temporal evidence too. So we analyzed the reaction time or the click time that participants took to solve the TSP. And we found that clicks between clusters took longer for both clustered and dispersed stimuli. So the residuals of the fits models, because we control for motor ability, are higher for between clusters compared to within clusters. And finally, we wanted to compare our results to a null model to make sure we're not picking up on a statistical artifact. So for that, we wanted to show you the distributions of the deviance metrics. So this is what the general distribution of the deviance metrics are. 0 means very aligned with using clustering for the TSP, and 1 means not very much. As you can see, it leans strongly towards 0, indicating a bias towards congruence. And if you split this over clustered or dispersed stimuli, so clustered on top, you see that the deviances for clustered stimuli are closer to 0 compared to dispersed stimuli, which follows the same pattern we've seen in our previous studies of reliability. And now if you split this horizontally over number of points, you can see that the deviances move away from 0 with increasing number of points, which could be that participants are forgetting their clusters or the clusters get too big for them to remember. But you still see that even at very high numbers of points, like 30 points, the deviances for clustered stimuli, the graph on the top, are still closer to 0 than the deviances for dispersed stimuli. And on this graph, if we now overlay a comparison with human clusters compared the deviances for human clusters compared to random TSPs, you see that the distribution is very different. So this suggests that this is not a statistical artifact, and human clusters, human TSP solutions, or humans might be using clustering for their TSP solutions. Yeah, due to time constraints, we couldn't go into our comparisons with k-means clusters and optimal TSP solutions. So please check out a paper if you want to learn more about that. So on to the discussion. So we generally find converging evidence that participants might use clustering to solve the TSP. In a prior work, we showed that clustering and TSP show similar reliability patterns over the structure of the clusteriness of the stimulus. And in this study, we showed that participants followed their clusters perfectly for 52% of the stimuli. Participants took longer to click between clusters, even after you control for motor ability. And participants were less deviant from their own clusters compared to k-means clusters or random TSP solutions. And generally, we think that clustering might play an important role in the solutions of other intractable problems as well. So we're currently investigating the properties and strategies used in human visual clustering. Yep, thank you very much. Appreciate any questions.
Thank you, Vijay. We have about 6 minutes for questions, and we've got one in the chat from Jim Quarter. So the question, if I understand how your interface works, it seems to me that it only allows certain strategies, those that involve not, quote, not lifting the pen, to use an analogy to paper and pencil. Can you comment?
Yes, that is true. Part of the reason we did that is that it seemed to introduce confusion in our participants when we were pilot testing. We had a version where participants could undo. And it also took too long since we needed a decent sample for to show statistical evidence of clustering. It seemed easier for participants to just, if they ruined a stimulus, to just like be like, okay, it's ruined, and then move on to the next one instead of editing one. But yeah.
Hi. So I really enjoyed this talk. Thank you so much. This was very cool. I have one question, which is about the experiment where you first had participants cluster the points and then solve the traveling salesman problem.
Yep.
And my concern is that maybe doing the task of clustering the points might have kind of primed the participants to use that same strategy when solving the traveling salesman problem. So I'm wondering if there's anything that, like any other experiments or evidence that you know of that can kind of like alleviate that concern that it might be task demand driving this connection between clustering and solving traveling salesman.
That is definitely important point, and it could be the case, but I think to alleviate that concern, we just point to the previous work we did on just clustering by itself and TSP by itself for like converging evidence that this is the case. So one could conduct the same study and flip. That could potentially be a next study, like flip the TSP and clustering orders to do it. The reason in our study we had a fixed order is that solving the TSP is pretty fatiguing because participants have to click precise points on the screen. So we want participants to like be done with the study after they're done with that task. But that's a very good point.
Thank you for your talk. So I have a question. So for clustering things, when you mentioned that the human are good at, it seems that when they solve the TSP problem, they're using clustering. Sorry. So when the cluster distance come closer together, so it's not cluster anymore. So in other words, if we zoom in, so we may see different clusters, but when we zoom out, we may see the not cluster anymore, and the human probably performance goes down. And this is one point. And the other point that when number of clusters increase or the data points in each cluster increase a lot, so I guess that human performance should decrease as well. So do you have any comment on this too? Thanks so much.
Could you repeat your first point? I did get your second question. Yeah.
Okay, so for example, in your slide now, on left, top left, so you have like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cluster.
Right.
So if your cluster come close together,
Right.
so I guess the human performance goes down to find the optimal path. So if the cluster distance increase, so the human performance and speed goes up drastically. So this is one point I wanted to mention, that if you work on it or have had any experiment to see that if what the students or the human react to this parameter.
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
So to answer the first question, in our previous study, we saw that for less clustered stimuli, so more like evenly spaced stimuli, participants were indeed worse. I think their solutions were 2% less optimal. However, people can be adaptive, I think. So people can change their clusters to be convenient for the traveling salesperson problem. So I think maybe that's why the difference is only 2% and not higher. And regarding the second question, if you increase the number of points, I do think that makes the problems way harder. And the clusters can only capture, people seem to only cluster around 5 clusters most of the time. So you do see participants' performance drop, but it's possible that because of the statistics of optimal TSP solutions, that drop still remains around 10% of the optimal true length, because with lots of points, the optimal true length also increases. Okay, but that's an empirical question. That would be a good one to test. Thank you for that.